Is metal white supremacist? Now, that's a rhetorical question if I've ever seen one. But my answer would be no, metal, the musical genre, is not inherently white supremacist. Is there white supremacy within the scene of metal? Yeah, there is. Are there certain things pertaining to metal that foster or support white supremacist sentiment? Short answer, yeah. But I'm sure you'd rather listen to an hour-long video explaining how and why, right? You know what this is concerning. Yeah, that video that really made the rounds. For those who don't know, musician Andrew Lee made this video and discussed his experience as an Asian man in the predominantly white space of extreme metal. Just watch it. I'm not going to give an in-depth analysis here, but basically he gives some history of being Asian in America in the West, the scrutiny and racism historically and personally experienced therein, and how a scene like metal is no stranger to these dynamics of power and hierarchy. The response to this video was visceral, and in terms of the relatively niche online metal world, was massive. Lots of people responded positively to his sharing of experience and knowledge. Lots used it as an opportunity to utilize a grab bag of classic anti-Asian slurs burning a hole in their pockets, but the predominant response was annoyance, defensiveness, frustration, and claims to metalness or lack thereof. Ironically enough, this was almost exactly the dynamic illustrated by Andrew in the original video. My goal with this video is to outline this dynamic and refute the most common sentiments arising from it in more detail. The supposed common sense metalhead's role in perpetuating social dynamics in larger society, the persistent influence and normalization of far-right and neo-Nazi rhetoric in these spaces, the decades-old excuses and rationalizations to reject or distract from these conversations, the distancing of metal from material reality that ends up serving the very systems of power responsible for the problems they complain about, and much more. And I'm going to be primarily discussing racism in the form of white supremacy, given it's the predominant strain of racism in recent history and metal. Race and racism as a broad concept obviously exists and has existed in many different forms across many eras and many civilizations, but in the modern era, as a result of stuff, white supremacy has by far the largest impact and prevalence. The most powerful countries in the world and the most dominant empire to ever exist attain such levels of power and maintain such power on the justification of white supremacy, a prioritization of white nations and a relinquishing of the lesser peoples to scraps and exploitation that has been normalized and adapted to various circumstances, but this hierarchy remains. Bringing up white supremacy all the time isn't an obsession with hating white people. The very concept of whiteness itself exists to justify exploitation of whoever is deemed lesser, support a hierarchy of races, and has an undoubtedly massive impact on history and the society we live in today. You know, dialectical materialism, looking at objective historical processes, blah blah blah, that boring shit. White supremacy coming from European imperialism is kind of a big deal, and particularly in a majority white space such as metal. Now, one of the first things I'm sure perked your ears and is commonly the site of initial pushback is the claim of metal being predominantly white. Upon hearing this, even without a associated negative connotation, you commonly receive the response of metal being for everyone, or a list of non-white people in metal. And it's true, metal as music and a scene has all kinds of people that feel some kind of connection or resonance, and all kinds of musicians from around the world. However, this clear fact is typically utilized at face value to end the broader discussion of racism there and then. If metal is so racist, why is there a black person in this band, or a brown guy at a show, etc.? Or what about XYZ person? Followed by a list. If you're into metal, I'm sure you got the list ready to go. This is a question that, if I'm attempting to be a prim and proper commentator, cannot be adequately answered with a quippy one-liner, but I'll do it anyway. Nice work listing all the non-white people in metal. Now name all the white people. We'll be here a while. My point here isn't to win a numbers game, but to show the true intention of this previous reaction to the topic of racism and metal, that being deflection and avoidance. And the existence of brown people in the scene is utilized as a tool to suit this aim. It's a first line of defense in the preservation and whitewashing of metal as some fantasy land where everyone's nice and It's immune to all that bad shit happening in society. It's not society, it's metal. There's lots more to say about the metal scene and the social capital exchanges therein, but when racism or white supremacy is brought up, things undeniably touchy and connected in whatever sense to metal, instead of gatekeeping occurring from a exclusionary standpoint with phrases like, it's not for everyone. The gatekeeping takes a different form by different people. This is where we can attempt to roughly group certain dominant sentiments within the scene. The vast majority are the self-proclaimed apolitical metalheads, valuing escape and comfort over anything else. I don't think all these people are horrible racists, but just like with any self-proclaimed apolitical, they make it real easy for horrible shit like white supremacy to spread by virtue of their blindness. And of course, there are those who don't do this pussyfooting around. They'll straight up embrace racism as a sort of exclusivity signifier or as an obvious poxmark to be combated. The neo-Nazis and the woke, so to speak. Deep down, all these rough groups understand racism exists within the scene, but it can be easily sidelined when a dreadfully uncomfortable conversation around racism is warranted. We as scenic participants know there's a bunch of bigots and shit, but instead of combating it, it's better just to pretend it's not a big deal or whatever. Commonly, you'll hear metal being abrasive, offensive, dark, and edgy on purpose, and it's just part of it whether you like it or not, which is true. And this truth lends credence when compared to essentially a liar attempting to preemptively whitewash metal from looking too bad. This purposefully edgy environment and embracing of abrasiveness also makes it easy to include bigotry, racism, and white supremacy because, well, that shit is edgy and abrasive. If you've been around metal for a while, you probably know about the dumb generalization of metalheads being the nicest people that only buy stuffed animals all the time, etc. And because of the abundant presence of dickhead or bigoted metalheads, this generalization is obviously wrong and annoying. But when it comes to white supremacy, this whitewashing generalization is more accepted despite being just as dumb and reductive. Like I said, the whitewashing is primarily done by probably the largest rough grouping of metalheads, those that consider themselves apolitical, and who consider metal a bastion against all the shit they would rather not be affected by, which, yeah, includes talks about racism and white supremacy. It's no coincidence this rough group is predominantly white, living in the imperial core and thereby standing in relative positions of comfort societally.
Soft hands, brother.
Hold on.
Soft
Yeah, I know
hands.
you got problems and life isn't all peachy for you, but at the very least, within the metal scene, you are a part of the predominant demographic, and just that on its own lends considerable impact to your comfort and perceived normalcy. Andrew Lee, upon making his aforementioned video, was largely referred to colloquially in various responses and comment sections as the Asian guy. Guess what, Buster? We understood who that was referring to. Seeing a comment referring to the white guy doesn't automatically make you think, yes, this is a reference to Leif Edling. Kinda similarly, if you say in a metal space, the gay guy, 9 times out of 10 you're thinking Baldy here. It's just an undeniable result of straight white guys being the vast majority of people in the space and the group bias therein. All of this is to say that the broad claim of metal being for everyone and that, look, here, a black person, is, in this context, nothing more than a flimsy initial defense to end an uncomfortable discussion before it begins. It falls flat amongst those in the know, because any one of us has a plethora of examples of asshole bigoted metalheads at shows or in bands, of casually racist dudes, not even to mention entire subsects dedicated to white supremacy and bigotry. So when confronted with this reality in the scene, and when taken seriously as a problem, an appeal to fantasy is easily disregarded. Hence, when met with the obligatory list of coloreds, I ask and wait eternally for the list of whites. And when met with claims of all inclusivity, I say how countless assholes piss and moan at alleged posers at shows, and bands are constantly scrutinized for not being metal enough, or any examples of metal being worshipped for its exclusivity. Miss me with the ridiculous facade of acceptance. Let's talk about the real shit. Think of it like a weaponization of identity politics, because it is. Identity politics is commonly a pejorative thrown around by right-wingers and centrists when any semblance of intersectionality is sniffed, i.e. talking about your experience as an Asian man, etc. In the context of metal and shit, as well as in lots of other things with the rise of woke fascism, which I'll get more into later. Identity politics is ironically and hypocritically weaponized to combat any intersectional analysis, but support the status quo. You hate hearing about what it's like to as an Asian man in metal, but love sharing how Mr. as a black gay person in your comments is actually super cool with how shit is. Seriously, this is like the oldest trick in the book. It's kind of depressing seeing it still utilized, but kind of makes sense considering the online metal community is perpetually stuck in 2013. Some supposed brown guy being cool with racism doesn't negate the presence of racism and its harmful effects, but it's valued by those who want to preserve the status quo, i.e., white people trying to not feel bad. It's kind of like the only black kid at school saying how funny he finds racist jokes. I loved it when you called me the N-word. It was hilarious, Brohim. The main purpose it serves is reassurance that everything's fine and you don't need to do anything about anything. Just being a nonchalant, chill guy is more than enough. Let's look at a common tool of weaponized identity politics in this conversation, Tom Araya, himself a Chilean. He's utilized in this context first and foremost due to his Chileanness, but also because Slayer bandmate Jeff Hanneman, who had just a itty-bitty obsession with Nazi Germany. No, it's just because it's so fucked up and it's perfectly fine, man. Was cool with Araya, so case closed, racism over. Well, he's also cool with his wife, and let's see what she just posted on Facebook. Oh, okay. Does his exotic ancestry suddenly make this not racist, or at least questionable? To someone not aware of the larger dynamics of power and racial hierarchies at play, like an apolitical white metalhead, the reassurance to keep on keeping on obscures how the black guy being cool with your racist joke is mainly a survival tactic, not an indicator of racism being overblown or dead. If you say how the joke was fucked up, you risk putting yourself out there as a hysterical woke scold who can't take a joke, etc. To remain accepted as one of the good ones, you conform to the sensibilities of the dominant sentiment, of which in metal are white sensibilities. And stories of isolated individuals have little to no bearing on larger systemic forces and historical processes that shape what an individual experiences. And these historical processes are, of course, a long legacy of colonialism by white countries over non-whites, creating the survival tactics and prioritizing the reassurance of white people. I'm going to get into the history towards the end of the video, so hold on. Instead of ignorance and deflection, undeniable bad shit like racism and namely white supremacy exist, and instead of making like an ostrich, must be countered. So, why, when confronted with these issues, is your immediate reaction to poo-poo the whole discussion? Most of the time, it's because how it is right now isn't too bad for a normal guy like you, and this is possible primarily due to your position as a white guy in a space with mostly other white guys. You can piss and moan at that all you want, or try to deflect to some cop-out make-believe fantasy. The presence of racism and white supremacy in extreme metal is very real, and your reaction to do nothing about it is largely responsible for its perpetuation, and this very uncomfortable discussion we're having right now. If you react to a person sharing their experience of racism within the scene by telling them to shut the fuck up, or that they're making a big deal about it, or it's actually all chill here, etc., you probably have some interest in the current state of affairs, namely that extreme metal is a white-dominated scene, where the interests of white guys are prioritized, and you or I, as white guys, have it pretty good that way, and don't want to see it change to something less catered around us, even if that really just means we're not gonna be a bigoted asshole, but to dudes comfortable with their current ability to be a bigoted asshole scot-free, that's too much of a shock, and, well, come on, just shut up already. This is partly why this topic is so frustrating, because all you gotta do is just not be a bigoted asshole, and be at least a little critical when approaching the topic of racism and shit. No one's asking you to self-castrate yourself, but when your conscious or subconscious perception of supremacy is put at risk, it might feel that way. Just like most things related to metal, heavy emphasis is placed on the individual, and if you as an individual denounce racism, that's all that matters. Not quite how that works, Buster. Now that we know the intention of this initial deflection and who's using it, let's dissect it a bit more, namely the obligatory list. You know who's on the list. Tom Araya, Caller of Storms, Mike Smith and Terry Hobbs from Suffocation, members of Death Angel, Keaton DePena, Herman Lee, Tosin Abasi, the new Sepultura singer, whatever. Suicidal Tendencies, Ice-T, Jimi Hendrix gets thrown in there. Immediately, there's some bullshit going on here. Most of these musicians are utilized to bulk up the list. When in the comfort of your buddy's basement or on the forums or whatever, they are heavily scrutinized. Be for real, dude. A tiny portion of these non-whites are truly accepted as authentic and true extreme metal musicians, and if limited to this qualification, the list shrinks considerably. Jimi Hendrix is usually included for whatever legacy reasons, but is he extreme metal? Animals as leaders, and most experimental prog is treated as some gay shit. Same thing with new metal and things with hip hop influence. What true metalhead you know prefers the new Sepultura singer over the Cavalieras? If I asked you to name extreme metal bands from Australia, you could probably rattle off at least a dozen off the top of your head. Let's see. Sadistic Execution, Destroyer 666, Bestial Warlust, Gospel of the Horns, Mortification, Striborg, Psychroptic. Name some from the Netherlands. Easy, Sinister, Pestilence, Centurion, Legion of the Damned. Now name some from the entire continent of Africa. Don't look this shit up, Billy. Come on. Overthrust? Yeah, I saw that video too, dude. The continent of Africa has 1.55 billion people. Holland has 16 million, but if you know your shit, you can name multiple times more Dutch extreme metal bands than African ones. There's, without doubt, countless metal bands from Africa that just didn't receive the acclaim or exposure certain Euro bands did, but this is in large part due, not to them sucking, but to extreme metal as a scene being largely Eurocentric and composed of Western white people who, subconsciously or consciously, view non-Eurocentric bands as a sort of novelty that mainly serve a purpose as reassurance givers. See, there are some brown guys playing metal. I'm not going to listen to them, but isn't it neat? It's a bonus if they're actually good and receive some popularity or acclaim. There are a number of factors that lead to this, like metal requiring relatively expensive equipment and ample time to practice, etc. It doesn't mean that there's some racial or geographical barrier to like metal or be in a metal band. But nothing here can take away from the reality that extreme metal, historically and presently, is predominantly white and Eurocentric, and it's not particularly close. This brings us to a key concept within communities that have a clear, dominant demographic representative: tokenization. The sparse representation of non-white people in extreme metal leads to their presence becoming magnified. Quick, name all the black guitar players in well-known extreme metal bands. Shouldn't be too hard, I named most of them on the list earlier. Now name all the Swedish guitar players. The sparsity and magnification of non-white people in extreme metal leads to them being placed on the list as a sort of specimen at a curio shop, much like women in metal and gay people in metal. Their sparsity is grounds for tokenization and crucial for the efforts of whitewashing and reassurance. Contrarily, the vast swaths of white people in extreme metal has a dual nature, a representative of the standard or normal extreme metal musician or fan, being a white guy. It's why we saw bands like Ghostbath garner such attention and fascination, because they claimed to be from China, an oddity within the scene, but the band was really from North Dakota. Just some regular white guys. The band Mullah claimed to be from Iraq, but after all their Arabic lyrics were shown to be poor mistranslations, they were really just from France. More recently, there was a band that was allegedly from North Korea, but was pretty clearly not from North Korea. Stuff like this is clearly done because the scene is predominantly white. Non-whites are fascinating baubles to ogle at. This is a good example of Orientalism, a concept I'm not going to get super in depth about, but in essence, it's the sense of entitlement the West has towards the Orient, their existence only serving the purpose of tickling the curious itch of white people, in this case, white metal fans. Incoincidentally, explicit white supremacists utilize this strategy too, namely neo-Nazi bands claiming to be from the Middle East just to serve as cover for vehemently anti-Arab rhetoric to be spread innocuously. Don't worry, guys, the Browns themselves say they suck. It's not just white people. This is a whole other topic I want to cover: how the anti-religious legacy, still present and evolving within metal, is utilized as sly cover to just be racist against brown guys or against Jews. The reaction to this is usually a branding of white knightism or how leftoids hate religion, but when it's the no-no religion, all of a sudden it's bad. I think the problems with all Abrahamic religions are pretty consistent, and I don't give a fuck about defending Islam as much as I don't give a fuck about defending Christianity or Judaism. Each of these religions can interchangeably be highlighted for horrific acts of oppression, violence, cruelty, manipulation, hypocrisy, and so on. The problem comes when these religions are racialized, when Islam becomes synonymous for brown and Judaism synonymous for whatever evil creature this thing is. Christianity is hardly ever as racialized, even when plenty of brown people, including East Asians, are Christians. Abrahamic religions being terrible, which I personally would agree with, shouldn't be an excuse to just shill white supremacy. Talk about how these religions are fucked up, there's ample material. Not how these religions are just barely veiled pseudonyms for why brown people bad. The problems with these religions aren't inherent via blood, but much like racism, are societally learned. In extreme metal circles, however, this clearly racist sentiment is naively misunderstood, partly due to what I would say is anti-Christianity fatigue and the contrarianness of metalheads, but also because, anti-Arab sentiment is just super baked into Westerners. But again, this is just a whole other topic I want to get into some other time. As someone whose brain is inundated with all the different pathways of far-right ideology and white supremacist rhetoric, I'll be the first to tell you there's a bunch of different shit that's thrown out there to relabel, streamline, whitewash, obfuscate, and so on white supremacy. But the through line of white supremacy remains, no matter the kooky hipster label you put on it. But this muddy water makes it so that those who aren't brain broken like yours truly kind of get lost in the mire of race realists, identitarians, anti jihadists, America firsters, etc. These guys eat shit and breathe contradiction and hypocrisy. That doesn't really matter too much. Race and racial hierarchies are irrational. It's based on nothing but vibes. So any justifications or reasonings therein are fittingly vibes based and irrational. It's why you see a black or Latino white supremacist, or a Jewish Christian nationalist, or an Indian Aryan, and so on. You can't look at this shit from a perspective of coherency, or be like, well, you see, this brown guy is racist, so your point is moot. None of this shit makes any coherent sense. That's kind of the point. Why else would you collectively punish vast swaths of people for some kind of impure blood inherent traits, you know? Hypocrisy and contradiction just flat out not mattering. It's kind of why I don't think the gotcha of black people made rock and roll, so therefore metal originated by black people is very useful here. And in a similar vein to how when talking about homophobia and shit in metal, bringing up hair or glam metal isn't the ultimate gotcha you think it is. Hair metal bands were constantly ridiculed and called gay and sissies by the more true metalheads, and the bands themselves partook in the most misogynistic activities in all of metal. Similarly, although metal obviously wouldn't exist without rock and roll, there's been decades of attempts to distance metal as much as possible from rock and roll, famously with Varg claiming it's a Judeo-Negroid, and countless extreme metal artists taking their influence mainly from classical or folk music. Pointing out the contradiction in rock and roll originating with black people and metal evolving from rock and roll is just met with, nuh-uh, my music evolved from Wagner or some shit. Let's get back to tokenization though. As a scene participant who automatically is deemed abnormal, a tokenized metalhead must adhere to a number of rules and norms to remain accepted. In most extreme metal circles, this means preferring the acceptable styles, which does not include nu metal, groove metal, alternative metal, anything with a hip-hop influence or a backwards ball cap implicated. You cannot appear too street or urban. Fixture in the online extreme metal scene and a somehow highly influential figure, J-Dog, has a recurring sentiment where backwards hats, sports jerseys, baggy shorts, certain vernacular thematics and the like are deemed homeboy gay shit and is unacceptable. This isn't some outlandish sentiment I'm saying. In these spaces, most people agree. It's no coincidence the homeboy gay shit is shit obviously associated with black and brown people. Now, he'll never say black or brown people aren't allowed, just everything associated with them. As a token colored in the space, you must accept this in order to be accepted. Otherwise, you can easily find yourself as a homeboy and thus unallowed. Hyrax singer Caton DePenna had said about being in the early thrash metal scene in the Bay Area, I had to learn about that music. It was almost like a survival skill, as I was the only black kid in the area. The Bay Area thrash scene, despite having ties with hardcore punk and its sizable non-white presence, primarily involved young white guys. Of course, people like DePenna or Tom Araya or Chuck Billy, the members of Death Angel, even Kirk Hammett being half Filipino existed, but they first had to learn the survival skills. And like I said before, now name all the white guys. Better yet, name all the white guys that have suspicious interests in the Third Reich. The vast majority of fans and people showing up to the crowds were young white guys. For every one non-white person, there's a dozen or more white guys. This doesn't make the Bay Area thrash scene evil and retroactively canceled. It just means the norms and sensibilities of one group dominated its existence. And these norms and sensibilities have a much broader historical and societal legacy than solely thrash metal. Much like most in-groups or communities, you gotta adhere to the norms and sensibilities of the dominant presence, or risk getting ostracized. Just so happens in metal, as well as most other in-groups and Eurocentric communities, these norms and sensibilities are white ones. And of course, when unfamiliar with a certain group, generalizations will occur, of which paint vast swaths of people in reductive and inaccurate ways, such as Indian people. Despite being a diverse country with a multitude of cultures and peoples, might as well get lumped together because, hey, we know they're not white, that's enough. This is pretty apparent when you hear the guys who made up that scene.
You don't know Kung Fu!
They might not be KKK members, but it's pretty standard edgy white boy shit, casual slurs and racist jokes and whatnot. It's all considered pretty normal and not a big deal. Because within predominantly white spaces, it's not a big deal, because they're not the butt of the joke. And to whoever is the butt of the joke, come on man, it's just a joke, don't ruin the vibe. Casual racism and, haha, look, a Hitler salute, are blatant examples of white supremacy being baked into society and normalized. You don't see young white boys joke about only one race, the human race,
So when I got into extreme metal in the mid-90s, it was a very strange time. Yes, you had your spots of color in the metal scene, like Suffocation and Blasphemy and Mystifier. But back then, it was largely uncommon to see black people in the audience, let alone playing in the bands. So even though I instantly loved the music, I was a bit uncomfortable by the culture. This is obviously before learning about the huge Nazi presence within the scene, and that's a whole other discussion. But back in those days, I learned that I was absolutely not welcome there, at least my local metal scene. I have a multitude of stories of people kicking me, spitting at me, using the dreaded N-word that everyone pretends today that they never use in their life. Yeah, it was a really rough time, man. But something in 16-year-old me said to not let the racists win and to keep coming back until they had no choice but to accept that I was there to stay. So it's wild that even though things have gotten much better, in 2025, black folks and other people of color are still struggling with the same fight. And that's how to be accepted within a scene that doesn't appear to be accepting. And unfortunately for a lot of us, the key is assimilation. I learned in the 90s that the way to fit in within the metal scene as a person of color is to pretend your race is not a factor. And what I mean by that is you are expected to engage with people, situations, and environments in a way that makes no one there, particularly white people, uncomfortable. Even if it means sacrificing a bit of your dignity and oftentimes your humanity to do this. A white person around you can say the N-word at a show. Ignore it. A person spits at you. Ignore it. A person literally assaults you, and it's very clearly based on the fact that they don't like your skin color. You have to ignore it. Why? Because they feel like you should feel privileged to be there. White metal gatekeepers feel like the price of admission for people of color also includes some sort of tribute to them. And what is this tribute? Typically, it's you reassuring them that they have no reason to be uncomfortable around you. You're not going to ruin their good time of hearing songs about murder by discussing how you may feel awkward that their friend Chad is wearing a shirt with a swastika on it. Or how you're annoyed by the conversation they're having with you about how you shouldn't be bothered by NSBM because those bands don't actually sing about it. Even though we all know y'all wouldn't care if they did actually sing about it. You also have to show them that the rumors that they've heard about people who look like you don't actually apply to you personally. You're different. You're special. You know what I mean? The whole point is To white metal gatekeepers, it's a black person's job to prove that they actually belong there. You know, because when a black person enters a white space like this, the default for a lot of white folks there is concerned because they don't know what to make of the situation. You know, should they wonder why they're being infiltrated? You know, should they be in fear? And for most people of color to operate within a white space such as the metal scene, the most we can hope for is invisibility. You know, to go to the show, see the band we like, and leave with no issue of note. But I'd be lying if I said I never found it odd that white folks are afforded the opportunity to voice their grievances with the world, whether it be with government, cops, the church, or chicks that won't date us, you know? But if a person of color dares to voice the concerns that they see in the world that are particular to them, then that's against the rules for some reason. It's hilarious to me how metal, supposedly the toughest musical scene there is the one that's so fucking afraid of being uncomfortable.
Additionally, bands from South America, specifically Brazil, which has a large and legendary extreme metal lineage, are treated as bastions of reassurance in this conversation, and almost as a gotcha to the fact of metal being predominantly white. We will get into whiteness as a concept later, but for now it's important to remember whiteness as something that can be given and taken away. It's rooted in extremely loose soil and only exists to differentiate the superior from the inferior. And especially in imperial core countries like the US, the dynamics of racial hierarchies and white supremacy in places like Latin America or Asia are either wholly misinterpreted or their perceived identities are weaponized. Both Mystifier and Sepultura are Brazilian bands, but he is clearly black and he can easily pass as white. Tell me which of these guys is white. Tom Araya, a Chilean, and Hellhammer, a pure Norwegian. Canelo Alvarez is Mexican, but if you saw him on the street, would you think he's anything other than a white guy? Amongst other white people, we're Italian or German or Ukrainian or Irish, etc. But amongst everyone else, these discrepancies melt together into whiteness, existing to separate the superiors from the inferiors. You can argue with a Greek or white Brazilian or Turkish guy about who's white or not, but when the black or brown guy shows up, it's pretty clear who's white or not. My point here is that someone being Brazilian or Mexican or South American does not immediately make them not white or not supporters of white supremacy. In fact, these places have a long history of white supremacy and racial hierarchies, being places where European invaders justified severe exploitation by way of creating racial hierarchies, of which their own race was conveniently at the top. Again, I'm going to get into this more later, but merely being from Latin America does not miraculously rid you of the connection with white supremacy and racism. Bringing this point up in this context as a deflection denies history itself in a bid to preserve some kind of comfort and reassurance that there isn't a problem here, because look at these happy Mexicans, or that, see, these brown people are racist too. It's a weaponization of identity politics in service of white sensibilities. Indigenous and darker-skinned people in Central and South America have historically been persecuted and treated as lesser by those claiming European or white heritage, a dynamic that doesn't depend on whether or not you view them as white or not. You see the tokenization dynamic frequently within far-right circles, their identity weaponized as a gotcha, but the token themselves never being truly accepted, even when they cater to white sensibilities to the utmost. Vivek Ramaswamy, despite sucking more white cock than your mother, still remains merely a convenient other within a space that has a clear white supremacist hierarchy.
So bright and articulate, and I guess I can call you articulate since you're not an American black. Can't say that about them. That's derogatory. And that was a great opening segment. Lots of things to talk about there. Oh, and I agreed with many things you said during, in fact, probably more than most other candidates when you were running for president. But I still would not have voted for you because you're an Indian.
Andrew Lee said it in his video, but black KKK guy, whatever the fuck is Daryl, even with the best of intentions, mainly just served as good PR for Klansmen to take advantage of and to get called slurs behind his back. He gets praised so much because he caters to white sensibilities and tricks white people into thinking, you see, if only you blacks were a bit more friendly. A token works best when there's a utility to be found, like the Klan getting a bit of PR, or perhaps within the Gulf states being horrible genocidal oligarchs, but hey, they're brown and look at their exotic outfits. American politicians and oilmen can't be racist, they're so chummy. Additionally, when confronted with such an oppressive racial hierarchy, and no chance as a colored person to be at the top. In a white supremacist world, alternative racial hierarchies are concocted to create some alternate universe in which actually my race is superior, such as fascists in India claiming to be the true Aryan race, or fascists in Mexico claiming superior Aztec heritage, both of which have a presence in extreme metal and serve to diminish the presence of white supremacy in a zero-sum, racism is racism kind of way. What cannot be lost here is the fact that white supremacy is the reason why such alternate racial hierarchies are concocted. If you're told that inherent racial elements place certain people over others, and you don't have any of those superior racial elements, you're going to craft your own storybook lore to conveniently place you at the top. It only works because racial supremacy is, in and of itself, fantasy, and therefore able to be shaped and rationalized in whatever way your imagination wants. When something like historical materialism and the legacy of white supremacy is poo-pooed and discarded, all that remains is fantasy. And because of this, the legacy of white supremacist racial hierarchies imposed by colonialism and still being perpetuated by those in power is lost in a mire of obscurantism, prioritizing the sensibilities of white people and they're not feeling bad, pointing out racism in places conceived as brown or oriental in the context of white supremacy is in a similar vein to the justifications of white supremacy itself. These lesser people suck anyway, they deserve to be conquered. We won, they lost. They're racist too, we're racist. It's all whatever. Metal exists in almost every part of the world, but quite obviously predominates in majority white regions. Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, and especially when looking at the most popular and influential bands. Why do you think the most popular and influential bands are from these countries? It's also no coincidence that the largest metal scenes outside of these regions are countries in Latin America, such as Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, all with large white populations, and in Asian countries like Japan and the Philippines, where Western colonialism has a massive effect on the concept of race and society. Andrew Lee discussed it in his video, and this is also a great video to watch concerning Japan's relationship with the West. But places like Japan and basically all of Asia are linked inextricably to Western colonialism and the white supremacist sensibilities established there, and hence why the best Asian countries are the ones most catered towards those white sensibilities, like Japan. Again, this whole list thing is just a weaponization of identity politics, and rather than identity politics being used to obtain woke points, its primary presence within metal is as a deflector and reassurance provider, and this appeal to reassuring fantasy, kind of like the fantasy of all metalheads being nice stuffed animal lovers, obscures and perpetuates the very real problems within the scene. This doesn't mean that racism amongst non-whites isn't a big deal. No form of racism or racial supremacy is good or worth supporting. I don't say what I say to win favor amongst the coloreds or to vilify white people as the worst. I know you're not babies, but Billy, you can't generalize an entire group of people based on just one person. And doubly, if you're able to hate an entire group of people this way, what's stopping you from hating another group? This is why the whole "I'm not racist, I just hate Indians" is ridiculous. If you're able to hate an entire diverse group of people based on inherent qualities like Indians, it's a little skip hop over to fill in the blank other large group of people. And, come on, you for damn sure don't reserve your hatred for just one group. Seriously, come on. At first glance, it seems strange that the attitude of the anti-Semite can be equated with that of the Negrophobe. It was my philosophy teacher who reminded me one day, when you hear someone insulting the Jews, pay attention. He's talking about you. And I believed at the time he was universally right, meaning that I was responsible in my body and my soul for the fate reserved for my brother. Since then, I have understood what he meant quite simply was the anti-Semite is inevitably a Negrophobe. And most of the time, white supremacy isn't just pure hatred for hatred's sake, but rather indifference. Indifference at the cost of your supremacy, or just indifference at the fact that you're not on the chopping block right now. You're one of the good ones until you're not.
What's the answer? What are we real Americans going to do about it? You'll find it right here in this little pamphlet. The truth about Negroes and foreigners. The truth about the Catholic Church. Now, friends, these books are free. Paid for by real Americans who want others to know the truth.
Excuse me, young man, but are you actually going to read that stuff?
Sure, why not? You heard what he said, didn't you?
Yes, I heard. Do you believe in that kind of talk?
It all makes pretty good sense to me. I'm speaking to you as an American. And I tell you, friends, we'll never be able to call this country our own until it's a country without. Without what? Yeah, without what? Without Negroes. Without alien foreigners. Without Catholics. Without
Metalheads. Metalheads? What's wrong with metalheads? I'm a metalhead.
Hey, that fellow's talking about me. And that makes a difference, doesn't it?
These are your enemies. These are the people who are trying to take over our country.
What you need to realize is that it's folly to understand racism in its current form as isolated occurrences in a zero-sum world, or as some magical essence. White supremacy must be objectively understood as products of white colonizers imposing their self-proclaimed supremacy by force, and how these colonized people respond to that force in order to assimilate and survive, or face more severe oppression. Japan developed their sense of racial supremacy over the rest of Asia in response to white Western nations justifying their land grabs via white supremacy. In a dog-eat-dog world of racially justified oppression, either impose and justify your own racial supremacy by force, or prove your inferiority by way of being conquered. The conqueror not only receives physical treasure, but also social treasure, namely societal dominance and a normalization of your superior sensibilities. Supremacy made self-evident upon the conqueror. It's might making right. Whites are clearly superior to XYZ colony because, well, we killed a bunch of them. Today, this supremacy by force is normalized, and I'm sure you utilize it here and there, especially as Americans, excusing the genocide of indigenous people by some claim to them being less advanced, justifying some foreign intervention because they aren't capable of governing themselves, or even rationalizing the worst conditions black people live in on some basis of them not trying hard enough, etc. These people come from an inferior culture. If they didn't, they'd have Xboxes and houses that they inherited from their parents. The position of normalcy, even when donned by the most well-meaning and nicest of people, implies some horrible shit because the normalcy itself was normalized by horrible shit. It's normal to be an American with an Xbox and whatever, but to be an American with an Xbox, millions of people had to be eradicated from the lands you live on, and countless more had their blood and sweat exploited to produce that Xbox. This doesn't mean you should kill yourself or grovel before your nearest brown person, but it shows how the normal humdrum of your superior civilization is based on the forced inferiority of others, justified on the basis of white supremacy, whether you're a good, nice person or not. The Australian wouldn't be just an Australian if not for the genocide of the people who were there originally, and it's no coincidence why a large chunk of the white supremacist sentiment in extreme metal is from Australia. It's baked into their identity of Australian.
One of the laws of capitalist motion and development is this inexorable expansion, and that means expansion into an expropriation of the third world, a process that's been going on for about 400 years, perpetrated by the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Dutch, the Belgians, the French, the English, and most recently, most successfully, most impressively, by the Americans. That is by the ruling classes of these countries, not by the ordinary people. The ordinary people simply paid the costs of empire. The ordinary people simply sent their sons off to die on the plains of India or in the jungles of the Congo or in Latin America, wherever else. But that expropriation of the third world has been going on for 400 years, brings us to another revelation, namely that the third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Most countries are rich. The Philippines are rich. Brazil is rich. Mexico is rich. Chile is rich. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. The capitalist European and North American powers have carved out and taken the timber, the flax, the hemp, the cocoa, the rum, the tin, the copper, the iron, the rubber, the bauxite, the slaves, and the cheap labor. They have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
It's important to understand this history and not give in to individualized shame and embarrassment that leads to deflection and reassurance, which easily leads to fantasy and continued justification of white supremacy from a position of faux victimhood. What kinds of fantasies I'm referring to I'll get to later, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's go back to the notion of niceness, and how as long as you're outwardly nice, it's all good. Most racists won't call you slurs right to your face. Lots of racist people are quite nice to the groups of others they view as lesser in one way or another. There's a reason why the term smiling racist exists. Racism gets falsely equated to meanness. So if you're just polite, you're all of a sudden not racist. But when no one's looking and respectability isn't necessary, the true sentiments are shared. And when you have generalized false perceptions of entire perceived races, it's inevitable that false and racist shit makes up these sentiments. That shit leaks through whether you would like it or not. And when checked on that shit, a response of defensiveness and faux victimhood show your true colors. As a member of the dominant group, lessers, who cater to your sensibilities, receive the status of one of the good ones. If Andrew Lee had a strong accent, he would undoubtedly garner a far harsher reaction, but because he sounded intelligent and had good English, he at the very least received some modicum of respect. My metalhead family member, he's not watching this shit, would never just straight up call a black guy the N-word, or an Asian person a dog eater or some shit. But to me, fellow white guy, he said some shit along those lines, and feels some kind of entitlement to grant one of the good one status to whoever satisfies him. For example, he says a ton of racist shit about Hispanic people in general, them being invaders and incompatible with American culture, etc. But Cubans he likes. You know, those people that agree with his hatred of communism, those are some good ones right there. He despises nu metal, slam, shit like that, especially Peeling Flesh for being too ghetto, but likes Ice-T because he did a song with bassed Megadave and served his country by portraying a fucking cop. Does the concealment of slurs negate racism? Does tolerating the nice boys excuse your hatred of those you consider not nice? Where does this sense of entitlement to deem or deny one as a good one? Being part of the dominant in-group grants a sense of entitlement to allow or forbid certain people or groups from receiving good one status. And this is only possible due to the normalized legacy of white supremacy. Here's a bit of history for you, Billy. The Southern strategy was the Republican Party's effort, starting in the 60s, to win votes by stoking racial tensions in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, particularly amongst Southern whites who got all pissy about blacks sharing water fountains. The absolute horror. However, starting in the 70s and 80s, the strategy involved more coded rhetoric and innocuous framing that on its face didn't flat out mention racist shit, but in practice served the same purpose of catering to a racist white voter base.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like force busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you get so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me?
Southern strategy, innocuous smiling racism, became kind of the predominant version of white supremacy, the better to get away with instead of getting chastised by some hippie or PC or SJW or woke scold. Now listen, I don't think the majority of metalheads are white supremacists or vehement racists, and I don't think you should feel bad for being a white guy, or liking Nordic mythology, or having connection to your culture and shit. I'm not out to cancel you, and I don't give a fuck what music you listen to. What I do think is that the predominant tendency of metalheads to be apolitical or escapist, etc., in tandem with the extreme and dark thematics in metal, lends considerably to an infiltration of white supremacist rhetoric and sentiment, and make it real easy to be affected by policy and ideological trends outside of the cozy den of metal, whether you like it or not. Let's take, for instance, perhaps the most general, thoroughfare embodiment of metal, Manowar. I know, not extreme metal, and they are kind of a laughingstock for their cheesiness and whatnot, but in terms of just the broad metal spirit or whatever, and what it means to be metal, they kind of exist as that in a caricature type of way. A consistent theme of Manowar is the metal spirit, where all that matters is your commitment to metal, of which unites us in a brotherhood of steel. It's basically a personification of the phrase, metal is for everyone. They make a big emphasis on metalheads being warriors of the world, uniting anyone in the world with a common love of metal. In lots of ways, corny or not, this is kind of true and is a powerful aspect of metal, something I'll touch on in a bit. However, Manowar's thematics include epic battles of us versus them, a ruthlessness towards those deemed lesser, and I mean, just flat out rape and shit. And when combined with the imagery of albums like Warriors of the World, where the white American man reigns supreme over his enemies, and Hail to England, where, I mean, just come on, look at this shit. As innocuous as Manowar overall may be, and as quaint as their thematics may be compared to most extreme metal, it fosters quite a bit of white supremacists uniting themselves in a brotherhood of steel against the others. Now, shut the fuck up, Billy. I'm not saying Manowar is a secret bastion of Nazis or some shit. I'm showing how even the most basic, general, and innocuous version of metal is easily utilized and appreciated by white supremacists to perpetuate racism, particularly because it is so seemingly innocuous and apolitical. When it comes to metal in general, and extreme metal in particular, where the music is the most important aspect, I do think as a scene it is special in its ability to accept anyone who can put out some good shit. If you riff real good or have mean vocals or just genuinely love the music, you'll at the very least be tolerated. It sort of sucks that this includes neo-Nazis, pedophiles, and everything in between, but hey, the good news is we'll accept you as a brown person if you can come up with some good riffs. This is the essential component of extreme metal's inclusivity. If you, for some reason or another, don't find shit like this to be absolutely atrocious, congratulations, you cleared the first bar. Extreme metal being so exclusive makes it so that when you are one of the few people who actually love it, there's gotta be something respectable about you. It's a very concrete and genuine level of acceptance and inclusivity, not some magical inherent quality of good-spiritedness from metalheads. I think this is actually pretty cool and valuable. Bonding with anyone who likes the same weird shit as you is pretty awesome, no matter who you are. There are some pretty awful pieces of shit, even just here on Metal YouTube, that I'd probably have a good time talking metal with, and having a beer or something. I said it in a previous video, but having such a strong and oftentimes religious attachment to such a niche and jarring thing can lead to a certain amount of ostracization, especially if you have a hard time finding a group who share this interest. This strong attachment and confidence with metal, in tandem with the alienation and ostracization of liking such an odd thing, creates what I call a reactionary victimhood, where you experience an amount of marginalization for something that seems so natural to you, in combination with an air of supremacy in your devotion to the almighty metal. You develop empathy for others who are marginalized, or you may feel strongly about injustice in the world, but you have no doubts in the supremacy of your religion. Metal thus becomes a place to congregate for true believers, where you can indulge in all the horrors, tribulations, and extremities of the world, far removed from its immediacy and impact, and from a place of comfortable, perceived supremacy. It's a haven for those seeking an escape of varying degrees, to a far-off universe or endless dungeon, or even just a bird's-eye view over the horrible shit that happens here in our world. Metal, as whatever kind of escape you want it to be, has minimal requirements, genuine enjoyment, and respect for the forefathers. Just so happens a common fantasy to escape to is a world where multiculturalism is vanquished, and you get to live amongst your race in eternal happiness. And where in the rulebooks is this not allowed? Hence why, if you find that fantasy harmful or unacceptable, it must be actively opposed. This ostracism, slight or not, sometimes has the effect of serving as a persecution status for those seeking positions of faux victimhood. You're not being oppressed in any other way. Well, other than the universal class dynamic, but the poor getting stomped on by the rich and whatnot. So being a stinky, sweaty metalhead will have to do. This is what I mean when I point out how metalheads understand oppression and empathize with marginalized people, but often misdirect this understanding by punching down instead of punching up. The question then arises, what leads people to get into extreme metal? It's a sociological question that requires some level of critical thinking on a systemic level. something the aforementioned comfortable, apolitical metalhead gets squeamish at. It's daunting to answer why most extreme metalheads are white and are from imperial core countries, and also that a not so insignificant contingent of white supremacists and their apologists exist within it, and how you, a supposed good, non-racist guy, exists so comfortably here. It's far easier to reduce it all to just some assholes existing in an otherwise ambivalent Big Ten. All of this conversation isn't an absurd fixation or obsession with race, or hating white people, or just a typical woke skull looking for something to be offended by, etc. It's a simple reality of the scene, plain to see for everyone with open eyes. The apolitical metalhead, clinging to comfort and normalcy, prefers to keep them closed. The problems arising from this reality is not that white people bad, but rather the consequence of racial hierarchy, in which a legacy of European imperialism and white supremacy placed white people at the top. This doesn't automatically make every white person a terrible person, but it fosters an environment in society where this hierarchy is perpetuated and the sensibilities of white people prioritized, which fosters fucked up shit like bigotry, hatred, violence, and ultimately genocide. Racism and white supremacy isn't inherent upon birth as a genetic curse, forever dooming you to be yelled at by blue-hairs. It's cultivated by society and the structures therein. You aren't born a racist, you live in a society that cultivates racism. This frustrates the apolitical metalhead, annoyed at their beholdenment to broader society. The power afforded by metal is its detachment, a ticket to someplace less mundane, where the individual is supreme and free from structural consequence. You choose what bands or albums you want to buy and listen to, which shows you do or don't want to go to, what people you do or don't want to be around. A reminder of your individual weakness is heresy. You didn't choose to exist in society. Why should you have any stake in the matter? This is a consistent dynamic when compared with the thrash metal movement of the 80s. Reagan-era conservative politics, satanic panics, and constant nuclear threats led countless young people, specifically the West's young white men, to assert whatever initiative they had and escape to somewhere on their terms. You want to force religious morality onto me? Fine, we can talk about black magic, Satanism, and the occult. You want to force economic and domestic politics onto me? How's catastrophic death, destruction, war, and nuclear holocaust sound? This frustrated, contrarian dynamic is a core part of extreme metal. Contrary to hardcore punk, attachment to society and the injustice present is more of a burden to scoff at or grand horror to look at with morbid awe, rather than a cause to rally around. This isn't to say it's a unanimous consensus. There are plenty of metalheads, typically associated with hardcore punk in some way or another, that have a strong commitment to combating the social injustice. But in a general sense, particularly in death and black metal, and even since the beginning of heavy metal, the predominant sentiment surrounding society or the injustice therein is, man, shit is fucked up. I just want to listen to some good shit, man. Leave me the fuck alone. Am I wrong? This sentiment was taken to a whole new level with black metal, facing societal questions with nihilism, and further escapist plunges into wherever or whatever lets you just not be bothered by this mundane shit. One of the many social injustices the self-proclaimed apolitical metalhead wants as little interaction with as possible is the issue of racism and white supremacy. It's frustrating. The individual metalhead, despite their best efforts, cannot just simply proclaim racism over. At best, they can denounce it and move on. Congratulations, you cleared the lowest possible bar. But at worst, the desire to escape and the escapist power granted by metal can lead straight to a number of convenient fantasies and dream worlds, namely concocted justifications of supremacy and a need for the lessers to be cold, a pseudo-spiritual fantasy of distinct and separate racial homelands, a manufactured scapegoating of one group or another that necessitates a righteous crusade, etc., etc. You might think the impetus on discussion around race and racism and shit is a commonality between annoying wokeoids and sweaty, stinky neo-Nazi types, and thus turns into a horseshoe of sorts. What this mistake discards is how the latter is but a continuation of escape, a running away from a sober, materialist look at reality, in favor of convenient narratives and justifications for even more injustice. A shying away from critical analysis that leads to fantasy and convenience leads to shit getting more convoluted and fucked up, including your very own psychic torment as a metalhead. Now, I'm not saying metalheads are the most oppressed group of people in the world, but especially in its earlier days, metalness as an identity grants certain levels of ostracism. I'm sure we're all familiar with. You know, having long hair, scary band shirts, wearing all black, in the worst cases being real stinky. You get treated differently by broader society, and particularly those in power, however slight. A refusal to acknowledge the dynamics around this ostracism does nothing but obscure why you feel persecuted. You lose sight of the original anti-establishment purpose of extreme metal, how this is inextricably tied with a stand against the neoliberal capitalist order and the powerful elite at the head of it all. You forget what the meaning and purpose of being anti-establishment is. You end up conforming and capitulating to the very sensibilities of the establishment, a passive acceptance of ruthless profit-seeking, of power consolidation and of exploitation, and a perpetuation of the obscuring narratives and scapegoating tactics to keep all this shit going. You disregard how the very non-white figures in metal, whose identity you weaponize, have been saying the shit you find annoying or woke. Native Blood by Testament is about Chuck Billy, who is Mexico and Pomo Indian, sharing his struggles with racism and economic injustice as someone with native blood, in which he explicitly says, "This white man's world won't tell me what to do." Sepultura has a long legacy of detailing the struggle of indigenous people in Brazil, and how the destructive forces of capital perpetuates white supremacy. The entirety of Chaos AD, from Refuse Resist to Slave New World, is about combating colonialism. Who do you think the colonizers are? Who and what do you think is being refused/resisted? The members of Brazilian black metal band Mystifier understood the scene as a battleground, in which injustice needed to be actively fought against. Members from Blasphemy seem to share this sentiment. Like most things concerning Blasphemy, it's near impossible to confirm anything, so take this with a grain of salt. But there's a story that KK Warslut of notorious fascist sympathizer band Destroyer 666 asked the band why they have an N-word in the band, and they proceeded to beat the shit out of him. Again, that's alleged. Metal as a scene is not magically free from societal problems like racism and white supremacy, but rather, it's a contested battleground in which we must actively combat its presence. The relative ostracism and otherness tied with being a metalhead may make it feel like these issues aren't as present, which lends to the apologetic and obscuring forces of white supremacy constant throughout the scene's history. There is just as much, if not more, excuses and apologia for openly white supremacist and neo-Nazi bands than there are people truly attempting to understand the struggle faced by non-white metalheads and musicians and do their part in the fight against it. I see more weaponization of identity to reassure than a true understanding of what these people are expressing. I see lots of metalheads using the identity of metalhead as an oppression Olympics entry ticket and free pass for further bigotry. Some of you seem to care more about a band member simply being black or brown or Asian than about what they actually experience and face as a black or brown or Asian person. Some of you would rather a minority give you a pat on the back instead of helping them get a boot off their neck. If you're woke, you probably have heard this a billion times, but I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, "I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action," who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. And if you think the usage of the word battleground is excessive, or that the explicit white supremacist presence is negligible and not that big a deal, I want you to consider just how many NSBM bands there are, the amount of fans of these bands, both fellow fascists and perhaps just apologists. In terms of extreme metal in total, a scene that ain't too big to begin with, this is not an insignificant chunk. It doesn't even include the presence of those hiding their power levels, so to speak, the self-proclaimed apolitical that just so happens to think the Mustache Man wasn't so bad, or who finds Varg actually kinda entertaining, etc. Edgelord guys, you know? Hate to break it to you. Edgy racism is just racism, Billy. Varg being a massive figure here is worth mentioning too, kinda serving as an eternal beacon for white supremacy to spawn from and congregate. Here's some food for thought. There are around 260 million voting eligible people in the US, and 77 million voted for Donald Trump in the 2024 election. That's only 29% of the voting population. But now, the increasingly far-right sentiment of the Republican establishment gets to impose its will to the detriment of whoever they deem opponents from a position of perceived majority. Does the support of this administration, being only 29% of the population, negate the positions of power and influence they now exert? I know, NSBM bands don't carry quite the same power as president of the most powerful country in the world, but within the scene of extreme metal, NSBM bands carry a level of scenic capital related to their perceived quality and authenticity, in large part due to the contrarian, edgy nature and whiteness of the scene itself. Being some kind of edgy bad boy is attractive in one way or another to lots of people within this space, regardless of their own professed ideology, and grants credibility to the white supremacist sentiment therein, available for serious consideration to whoever stumbles upon it in the marketplace of ideas, similar to how someone like Nick Fuentes can spread his influence, his toxicity, emitting noxiously sweet pheromones that are so terrible you can't look away. And who knows, maybe he says a sensible thing or two, and so on and so on.
To someone who embraces the oppressive nature of white supremacy, everything that is in opposition will always appear to them as victim mentality. And that's because white supremacy doesn't mind having victims. I mean, that's kind of an expected and direct byproduct of it, right? But the last thing it wants are vocal victims. You know what I mean? Victims are meant to suffer in silence because the goal is to always make the ruling class feel as happy or as content as possible. And if what the ruling class is doing makes you uncomfortable, you are expected to see it the same way that they do, as a simple part of life. What can be done to make metal a place for everyone? I think the music itself is for everyone because, you know, I don't view art as being segregated in that way. But not all scenes are created equal. So what can your individual metal scene do to quell some of this? First off, understand that your white space is nothing but a construct, and constructs can be dismantled once they're understood to be constructs. So place real tangible value on the voices of people of color within your scene. There's no reason that some jackass in Vermont can't spend time learning how to properly pronounce a bunch of Scandinavian words so they won't offend some random Norwegian guy when they say an album title out loud, but they can't take the time to understand the plight of someone who lives down the block from them and spend a little time doing their part to alleviate even a small fragment of tension that currently exists in the metal scene centered around race or gender or sexuality. So this metal brother and sisterhood that they love to sing about can actually become something real, and our scene can be that much stronger. And if your immediate response to any of this is, well, if you're uncomfortable, then extreme metal just isn't for you, then I want you to look in the mirror, sunshine, and say that to yourself 5 times out loud while listening to Dawn Raid. And maybe then we'll be making some progress.
Now, here's where we'll get into a bit more detail about the current strains of racism in our society, namely white supremacy and its historical context. I'm going to try my best to explain a lot of shit here, but I'm obviously no expert. I recommend these videos if you want more in-depth shit. And a warning, this section isn't going to be crazy metal focused, so either buckle up for a history lesson or go listen to fucking Doomakiss for the 1000th time. Those are your options, Buster. Also, how much convincing am I gonna do here by just saying racism bad? You fucking nerds deserve a thorough dissection, so here it is. First, I'll say, I would fucking love, or at least I would have loved, and it would be a lot easier, if the world was just Deadliest Warrior. For those who don't know, it was a show like 15 years ago that pitted one historical figure or warrior against another in a battle to the death, like Spartan versus Ninja, or Samurai versus Viking, or Zulu versus Aztec, etc. If you know, extremely metal show. There was an implication of fairness and being unbiased, like they would do tests on ballistic gel torsos and shitting, claim it was all run through advanced simulative technology and the best warrior would win. It made it seem like all these civilizations and cultures all existed in a zero-sum world and history was decided based on otherwise fair fights between participating competitors in the marketplace of combat. As cool and entertaining as it is for a teenage boy, the concept is obviously bullshit, but not too dissimilar compared to the escapist and concocted fantasies espoused by race realists or identitarians or free thinkers or what have you. It's a made-up world where systems of exploitation and societal hardship are rationalized as some survival of the fittest or the outcome of a fair fight, and therefore it's poppycock to whine about racism and systemics and other woke Marxist babble. They lost and we won, fair and square. But the world and history isn't Deadliest Warrior. What throws a wrench into the discussion of racism and white supremacy in metal is this appeal to some vague notion of presentism, where all that matters is here and now, and any whining about past injustice is just that, past injustice. The browns and blacks did fucked up shit too, and here we are today. Now shut the fuck up and listen to the goddamn metal. It disregards or minimizes what led to this moment of you just being some guy wanting to just listen to some metal. Believe it or not, but you and metal exist in society and are a product of historical and ideological forces leading all the way up to right now. Ignoring this connection or concocting convenient narratives to make you comfortable does nothing but allow the very same historical and ideological forces to march onward and perpetuate the same shit we gotta deal with right now, including white supremacy. I did type a billion words about a lot of shit here, going super in depth about a bunch of shit like the history of racism, whiteness, and anti-immigration sentiment, and the ideological trends of neo-Nazis, and highlighting hypocrisy and shit. But how much in-depth shit does it really take to convince a neo-Nazi they're wrong? How much do people really care about hypocrisy when each and every one of us are hypocrites? There is truly so much shit to dissect and go through to exhaust this entire conversation, so I genuinely suggest just having a critical mind when it comes to this conversation, instead of childlike frustration and dismissal. There being even one neo-Nazi or white supremacist feeling comfortable and at home in this scene is, in my opinion, grounds enough for, at the very least, an earnest conversation surrounding white supremacy and its harmful legacy. That being said, I'm going to try to tackle some shit we hear in the scene a lot. Now, like I said, people aren't born racist. White supremacy in its current fashion did not just spawn from the ground. Despite neither racism nor slavery beginning within the last 600 years, the dominant strain of racism today did come into being as a descendant of East versus West clashes of Christianity and Islam and a myriad factors, culminating as a justification of the European colonization of the New World and the Atlantic slave trade. Whiteness was solidified as a concept to justify the oppression and exploitation of the lesser peoples, lesser by the blood inherent in their veins. Pseudo-scientific explanations were concocted to further justify this exploitation. If these people weren't biologically inferior, all this horrible shit we're doing looks pretty bad. It's actually just because we're so much better than these idiots. This justification and rationalization necessarily occupied all levels of society to function effectively and perpetuate the newly cultivated systems of power. The new racial hierarchy served and justified a class hierarchy and provided a convenient scapegoat to deflect and a justification to preserve positions of power and dominance. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you. This social system of justified oppression, created to enrich the ruling classes of Europe, consequently infected all of society, continuing to this day as a sort of poison sting. The average European peasant didn't have a particularly negative opinion or sense of superiority towards Africans or indigenous Americans until the conquering ruling classes of Europe poisoned the wellspring of society with their twisted justifications. The ruling elite needed this justification to continue benefiting from exploitation. The poor whites were tricked into feeling like they were at least better than this other group of miserable sods. And this latter rationale, of course, benefits the rulers by redirecting frustration with being a miserable sod onto another miserable sod with a clearly identifiable trait such as skin color or accent, etc. Those falling for this, centuries ago up till today, are nothing but rubes, fools getting tricked into bitter hatred against a fellow human, just for some fleeting mirage of supremacy and shiny myth of belonging to a mighty race, dangling on a stick by those with a boot already on your throat. This is where it's important to emphasize material reality over the deadliest warrior-esque fantasy propagated by white supremacists and fascists over the years. Myths of isolated races and shit obscure the actual realities of history. The predominant sentiment amongst white supremacists and fascists today is a crusade against multiculturalism and a claim to homelands for each race. This sentiment can be referred to as white nationalism, identitarianism, or America First stuff. There's common tendencies to muck up this conversation by delving into ridiculous fractured labeling minutia, but the common through line is the crusade against the perpetual threat of multiculturalism, and the solution is this: get rid of the other cultures in your racial homeland. If we were all the same race, we'd all get along. This solution is just the long version of calling for genocide, obscured by a thin veil of smiley face rhetoric, like claiming we're not calling for violence, we just want every race to live in their own respective spheres. Or, we don't hate other people, we just love our people, etc. Barely hidden beneath this veil is material reality, exposing a myriad of contradictions and hypocrisies. Supposedly white homelands like the US, Australia, and Canada are only white homelands because of genocide, and they are conveniently immune from this fact on the basis of time frame or some shit. And the people born in these countries who aren't white are the ones who have to leave, despite having just as much of a claim to it. And if given the excuse of conquering being fair game, how is an invasion of brown hordes not a fair conquering as well? It's because hypocrisy doesn't matter, and material reality doesn't matter so long as the right material ends up in the right pockets. This whole shit exists to keep certain people on top, and to serve that aim, a convenient narrative must be created, because, well, you got a whole lot of contrary reality to go against. The pipe dream of a non-multicultural world is nothing but a deadliest warrior-esque fantasy. Don't get me wrong, the world hasn't been or never will be rainbows and sunshine, but culture, especially the culture of this region, has never been isolated to the point of distinct races. In fact, Homo sapiens from the entire world share essentially the same DNA. No distinct racial genes exist. Any attempts at scientific racial evidence has either been disproven or exposed as dishonest and bad faith attempts to justify further exploitation and hatred. For example, most physical evidence of distinct races is revamped or dusted off pseudoscience from the 19th century, such as skull measuring utilized by people like Varg, or ancient aliens archaeology to prove how Africans couldn't build anything on their own, etc. When physical evidence can't be utilized, cultural or spiritual evidence is concocted. It gets rebranded as race realism and only serves as a way to appear smart and sciencey, even when that science is sourced out of a 19th century genocidal lunatic's crack pipe. Not only does this disregard the historical and material reality I discussed earlier, it starts from a fantasy land of distinct racial culture existing in the first place. Even the archetype Northmen are most known for their travels and spreading of different cultures and traditions, often by force, but often just because their shit fit in with a bunch of different people. Also, our concepts of racial identity are heavily skewed and fantastical. Italian culture is synonymous with red sauce and pasta and classic Roman architecture, right? Tomatoes are native to the Americas and didn't reach Italy till the 17th century. Also, Roman architecture is heavily inspired from Greece. What's traditional Italian culture then? How many cocoa trees have been harvested within the borders of Germany for their famous chocolate? How much tea was cultivated on the British Isles? How much gold and silver and luxury products were mined from French or Swiss soil? What I'm not saying is that there isn't any part of European culture that isn't unique or cool or worth being proud of. I'm an Italian man who is proud of Italian shit. What I'm not proud of are the aspects of that culture that came directly as a result of white supremacist exploitation. Why should I be proud of something that only exists because it was ripped from someone else's hands and excused away by some vague notion of racial supremacy? I don't feel particularly proud of Gangs of New York ass shit, and I don't want to trick myself into thinking of my heritage as Roman centurion versus. This is why the concept of white pride is so fucked up. Whiteness was created to unite and justify the exploitation of non-white people. It has no coherent qualifications or cultural distinction except the lack of whoever you don't like or want to exploit. Again, this doesn't mean you need to kill yourself right now for being white, but rather understand what whiteness was created for: the unification of the superior oppressors over the lessers. The point here is that your whiteness is conditional and only exists to position yourself over whoever you deem lesser, and for whatever reason it could be taken away or diminished when convenient, such as the 19th century European immigrants in America or the Jews in Nazi Germany. Deflecting to the persecution of Irish or Italian immigrants is just deflecting to another example of white supremacy. Scapegoating immigrants for society's ills is another one of the oldest tricks in the book. The rulers who benefit from a structure of exploitation easily redirect outrage rightly pointed at themselves by pointing the finger at the most marginalized members of society, the new kids on the block. The riling up of fear of the other is powerful in its ability to utilize fantasy. It has unlimited possibilities of us against them to channel in the aims of scapegoating. White pride is a statement of dull ignorance at best and a proclamation of supremacy and right to domination at worst. It can never be detached from its historical legacy of justifying exploitation because it was specifically created and perpetuated for that aim. White pride is an embracing of the lack it was created to signify, a lack of inferior blood, and an identity founded on justifying domination. It ignores history in favor of convenient fantasy. It wasn't so long ago that worse treatment based on race was legal in the US, where lynchings were commonplace and race riots went unpunished, where slavery by a different name was legal, where attempts at changing this was met with fierce resistance and a dragging of heels and so on. White supremacy isn't just some country bumpkins being dumb. Country bumpkins are just one of its many rubes and victims. White supremacist ideology has been behind the levers of power in the most powerful countries in the world for centuries, and is a huge reason as to why countries like the US, Canada, and Australia even exist in the first place. You think this doesn't have a lasting effect? You think it's something that just passively goes away? If the lingering poison sting of white supremacy is ignored or embraced, you ignore or embrace the reasons why so much shit is fucked up, and in effect allow it to carry on. You choose to live in a fantasy where humanity is doomed to eternal bitterness. Sounds like a pretty fucking cool song name, but come on, focus for a second, Billy. You allow yourself to be tricked into hatred along made-up lines that constantly shift to keep you on the track of hatred. You allow those in actual positions of power to benefit from your hatred while you only get more embittered. You allow the continual degradation of the supposed lessers because it rationalizes your preconceived hatred. You want the people you hate to get worse so that it excuses their eventual righteous annihilation. You fail to see how this will never benefit you, aside from fleeting feelings of supremacy over a group of people you don't even know. White pride is a jealous reaction to oppressed people organizing and rallying against their oppressors. It centers the sensibilities of those who identify with whiteness and the inextricable link that whiteness has with whoever is deemed non-white. The dynamic of white supremacy fosters severe paranoia over what it will be like if the hierarchy is subverted. The subverted hierarchy for those at the top is a crumbling, even if that crumbling is only to an equal footing. Lots of neo-Nazis view their pride in their race from like the perspective of some primordial culture, like going back thousands of years in their ancient forest where they were pure and untainted, etc. But think about how their life existed in that like primordial forest compared to how Native Americans existed. How fucking different could that possibly be? A non-multicultural society is a dangerous fantasy, inevitably leading towards genocide, not only against the inferiors in your nation, but towards the inferiors surrounding your nation, putting to waste their resources and potential living space for a greater people to take advantage of. Lebensraum, or living space, was what the Nazis sought for their race to prosper, limited by Germany's borders. This, of course, led to inevitable conflict with Eastern Europe, their people being obviously inferior, and their superseding justified by a superior race to make good use of the land. Despite this, the Nazi Party postured themselves as mainly concerned with their own people, just the small beans in our little nation, and we just want to be our own little nation. Similarly, in what served as inspiration for the Nazi Party was Manifest Destiny in the US, a divinely ordained right to take the land from its inhabitants on a basis of racial supremacy. Also, similarly, the US lied to the natives by claiming they just wanted some land and you get yours and we'll exist in our separate spheres, blah blah. Racial ethnostates based on supremacy and a right to domination will of course lead to actions predicated on that perceived supremacy. If your race is superior and you just want the good of your race, why would you not support the conquering of a place with lesser people who are wasting that potential living space? You need that space for your mothers and babies, for the good of the race. Ethnostates never keep to themselves. They seek Lebensraums, cheap ways to exploit labor, or quests for glory on the battlefield, etc. The power and status of Western nations is in large part due to the exploitation and domination of others. Case in point, the very land you live on. You, falling for the sweet embrace of the poison sting, is doomed for torment. You're nothing but a rube, a pawn in the power games of a ruling elite that's happy to keep you falling for dumb scapegoats like fucking brown people. It's no surprise that when those in control of the levers of power impose such a racial hierarchy on society, those at the top benefit both economically and mythologically, and those at the bottom suffer. This dynamic not only keeps a good thing going for the conquerors, but perpetuates the degradation of a group of people, artificially imposing inferiority by force. This artificially imposed inferiority keeps the perception of white supremacy rolling like an exponential snowball. Positions of wealth and power were gained by ruthless brute force and exploitation that simultaneously gave you great riches and the exploited great poverty, and these great riches helped you keep this snowball rolling in a ruthless cycle. Additionally, even in today's neoliberal world order, global North nations in numerous ways rely upon global South nations to keep themselves propped up, such as in agriculture, manufacturing, resource procurement like mining, cheap labor to exploit, and vast profit margins to be maintained.
They have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
Their positions of dominance were founded on not some mystical divine destiny of the white race to reign supreme, but on exploitation, and continued dominance required continued and expanded exploitation. Global South countries who fight against this system are met with harsh reprisal, such as in Indonesia or a myriad of countries in Africa and so on. Here's a bit more history for you, Billy, because I can hear you ranting and raving about Italians and Irish, Italians and Irish, Italians and Irish. The first slaves brought to the Americas by England were predominantly African, but included a number of indentured servants, mostly Irish. And do I need to tell you how the Irish were viewed by the English? You think that wasn't fucking some kind of white supremacy? Anyway, indentured servitude and chattel slavery differed in that indentured servants would be freed after a time, and even sometimes contracted to have a job or land after their servitude. However, the common suffering of African slaves and Irish servants led to camaraderie and bonding, which included frequent revolts and uprisings against their masters. This is a huge component of slavery and white supremacy, the constant dread and fear of violent reprisals by the people so clearly abused and exploited. This dread necessitates oppression and justifications for that oppression. It also brought forth a successful strategy in avoiding uprisings and revolts. Divide and conquer. Blacks and whites teaming up to take down their masters was too scary, so they propped up the white servants with foreman positions and authority over the black slaves. This of course stoked tensions between them, cultivating racist sentiment, but crucially kept them from teaming up for uprisings. Black and white people didn't inherently hate each other and fight due to proximity. In common struggle, they cooperated and understood the common enemy, the wealthy and powerful oppressors. The wealthy and powerful oppressors understood this was dangerous and did what they could to put them against each other. This worked so well because the white servants had the possibility of at least being white, an inherent supremacy that made even the lowest white man better than the highest black man. The discrepancy was readily apparent just based on eyesight. He looks different. Similarly, in the 19th century, Chinese immigrants worked on the railroads on the West Coast, coexisted with white people, and ate chop suey, and believe it or not, didn't have constant race wars. Until the owners of the railroads stoked the racism fires and did the whole damn immigrants taking your jobs routine. The white supremacist claim of multiculturalism not working is nothing but a internalization of centuries of ruling class efforts to maintain power. You've been tricked into being a bitter, hateful, ignorant idiot just so Mr. Bigwig Fat Cat Corporate Jagoff can keep the heat off his back. Well done, you stupid fuck. In return, the ruling class policy continues to keep certain people in horrible conditions. Like I said, artificially imposed inferiority. And instead of comprehending the dynamics of power here, you'd prefer to keep living in the fantasy land where you get to be on the winning team just because your blood is better or some shit. This is where I'll mention how it's pretty common for white leftists to dismiss race as a distractor from class. Racism was and is utilized to serve class interests via distraction and divide and conquer type shit. But this doesn't make it purely an invention of the ruling class. Racism is so useful to that end because it has been internalized so much and permeates so much of society. But this is a whole other topic. There is so much more I could say regarding this topic, but I'm going to keep this video under 10 hours. You're welcome. I'll end on this note. You're one of the good ones till you're not. Racism and white supremacy, it's not inherent in your blood. You learn that shit.